I'm chatting with James Bartlett. He is the author of The Alaskan Blonde, and this is the main source I used to write this episode about the murder of Cecil Wells. And I just wanted to talk to him about the book. So, welcome, James.
Thank you, Robin. It's great to be here.
I really appreciate you taking time to do this and to tell us a little bit more about this crime. And also, I really want to thank you for writing this book. I tried to write about this crime a few years ago, and I wrote a short article about it, but there just wasn't much out there. And it seemed like such an interesting crime. There was just so much about it that was interesting. So when I saw this book come out, I couldn't buy it fast enough. And if you look at my copy, you can see it's very, very dog-eared.
With all the mistakes in it, you've noted all the mistakes and things like that. It's probably
No, I didn't, but I didn't. But isn't that awful when you write a book? No one writes a perfect book. There's always some typos and stuff in them. But I have marked it and written in the. You'll probably be appalled by this, but I've written on it and put stars on it and everything.
That's what you should be. That was what I was hoping, because when I wrote it, I just thought, like you, what an interesting story.
Yeah,
And I just thought this is the kind of story I would want to read about.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're reading it and going, oh, and thinking of things, that's perfect.
Good. Yeah, I loved it. And I also want to mention that this book was a finalist for the 2023 Boucheron Award for Best True Crime Book. That's really impressive. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, thanks. It's the Anthony Awards are pretty high up on the scale, so I had absolutely no thought in mind whatsoever that it would possibly get nominated, but it did. It didn't win, yeah. But the person who won was the person I would have voted for. So I didn't get jigged on the voting.
Yeah,
the person who won was a deserved winner, but I think I did well.
That's great, and it brings and people noted it and put eyes on it. So you did really well with that. And since my podcast listeners have just listened to this episode, I don't think we have to worry about ruining anything from the book by discussing the details of the case. But I want to encourage my listeners to buy the book, because there is so much in it that I did not cover. And it's really very, very interesting. I know you're going to like it. It goes into a lot of detail about things I think are very important. I just didn't have the time to cover it in my podcast episode. So I've read and listened to some of the interviews that you've done, and you make a statement that I often make when I write true crime stories, and that's, you can't make this stuff up. True.
No, it was there was stuff that I was finding and that I was reading about that I just read it, and I knew that, because my wife writes fiction. She writes mystery novels.
Yeah.
And I knew that if I read that in a fiction mystery novel, I'd go, well, that's ridiculous. That would never happen.
That's what I think, because I write fiction novels too. And I think I couldn't put this in one of my novels. People would say, no way, this would never happen. But you listed some of the things that in your research that you uncovered that surprised you. But one of the aspects that you did not mention, or that I didn't hear you mention anyway, was one of the biggest things that shocked me. And Diane's autopsy revealed that she'd been pregnant soon before she committed suicide. She either aborted the baby or had a miscarriage. Did you know that before you looked at the autopsy report? Or
no,
did you?
I didn't know that until I found the newspaper articles about it, because I actually found out about the as you say, no spoilers. I actually found out that Diane Wells had committed suicide before the trial, early on in my research.
Okay.
That was what kind of interested me in the story, because I read that and I thought, goodness, she must have been desperate to kill herself before the trial. I wonder what had happened. Then I read about the circumstances of the murder, and I thought, well, wow, no wonder, that sounds amazing. So it made me work back. But then as I worked through the story and found out what had happened, you sort of go through the book and go through the research at the same stage that they are, albeit 70 years apart. And I got to that stage, and I can imagine sitting in the room with her, and if she was pregnant, what she was thinking, and was she thinking, who's the father, maybe?
Yeah.
It could well have, Johnny Warren could have been the father. Cecil could have been the father. It could have been someone else that she'd met in the last 4 months. was the father. And I'm sure she sat there and thought, I can't go into a trial looking pregnant. I can't go into a trial even with the appearance of being pregnant, because people are going to judge me and immediately jump to the conclusion, the worst conclusion, and it's not going to go well. And I think that played into her decision. And, you know, and especially at the time, unfortunately, like it is now in a lot of places, that was something you could not do legally. So she then had to go, and she was in Los Angeles. She had to go and find somewhere. If she did actually get a termination, she had to find someone to help her to do that.
I know.
Which must have been, very upsetting and frightening. But then if she had had a miscarriage, that's just as traumatizing as upsetting.
Yeah.
You know, and that was something that just added to the tragedy of it, really.
Yeah.
That you know, her suicide note said, you know, she's doing this because she doesn't want to essentially ruin her young son Mark's life, you know, for him to be traumatized by this trial forever. And she'd just been pregnant herself.
And as it turned out, she wasn't successful at protecting him from trauma, and she probably made it worse by her suicide. But
it was, as I said in the book, when I spoke to him, I only spoke to him the once, and initially he was so keen. He seemed so keen to want to talk. And I just thought, well, this book is going to write itself. You know, I just have to talk to him, even though he was a baby at the time. He's a fully grown man now. You know, he has he's as close as it could be. And then he wrote me the letter and said he didn't want to do it. And it had brought up some bad memories. And you know, and I did, you know, do some research on him. And there are other reasons why I think he probably didn't want too deeply. But I did speak to his son a lot. And his son had a tough time with his father. So it just goes down the generations.
Yeah. And that is one thing that I didn't go into that I just loved about this book. And I've found out from my stories is that violent crime doesn't just affect the victims. It affects the families, it affects the friends, and oftentimes it affects the entire town or place where it was. You know, it really affects a lot of people. So, and I get emails from people, you know, I'll write about a crime, and sometimes I get too into the crime, you know, the victim, the crime, and I don't think about it. But then I'll get an email from someone that says something like, yeah, that was my auntie, and she was such a sweet woman, and it brings you back that, you know, these are real people, and these horrible things happened to them, and it affected everyone they knew basically.
It's just one moment, as they say. It's just one moment, and then it just takes. It's like if you have a family tree, suddenly something's just taken out of a family tree. And that means the family tree can't be done fully correctly because there's always that hole. So people always never know. And, you know, I was talking to people in their 70s who were going, I just don't know anything about it. It's a complete mystery to me. The family never talked about it. I really don't know anything. What do you know? And I was like, wow, I didn't expect that. I thought, you know, that it would be something that they talked about all the time. And there were friends of Cecil Wells's. There was a family friend. They talked about it right for decades afterwards. It always came up in conversation. And I met them last time I was in Fairbanks. I had breakfast with about 6 of the family members, and they were like, oh yeah, Dad mentioned it all the time. You know, we talked about it. Sometimes it came up at weekends. He was absolutely convinced. He never forgot about it. And for his whole life, you know, and so it does affect down the generations.
That's it's very sad. I was surprised by how cosmopolitan and modern Fairbanks was in the 1950s, and you did a great job of painting the picture of what it was like there. And the Northward building, oh my gosh, it's like another character in this crime. And it's just so hard to imagine all these rich people living in this building, and they can hear each other's fights and conversations. I think it's through the heating ducts or something.
The vents, that's right,
I mean, it's like something you'd see on TV.
The building's still there, and it was in a movie in 1960. And, you know, people have emailed me from the book saying, I used to live in the building and we used to run up and down the corridors. There was a ast we all used to, I would love to write, I don't think there's enough there, but I would love to write a book about the Northwood building because it's still there.
Yeah.
It's still, the building is still there. There's still a couple of stores on the street level. There's still people.
Is it still apartments in the building?
It's all been completely compartmentalized even more now. It was all apartments then. They're even smaller apartments now, and it's sort of lower income housing, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But it's all, there's a lot of apartments. There are some businesses mainly on the lower level. There's some government buildings. There's a few commercial businesses, but the building looks exactly the same. It's the same building. They haven't, made it any higher or painted it or anything like that. So it's just the same as it was. And it was the hippest building when it was built.
Yeah,
when
sounds
Cecil
like
and
it.
Diane were there, it was the hippest building in around, which is, why they moved there.
Yeah.
And so it's still there. And I found that there are, it might be a question you're going to ask later, but there's another story I'm working on, believe it or not, that was another murder that happened in the Northwood building.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
Again, it's not contemporary. I try and stay away from the contemporary things, especially now, because I realize these family members are all still around and it's still quite fresh.
Yeah,
but
I agree. It's hard to write about something that just happened.
Yeah, I don't want to really upset someone who really is young and remembers it really well, rather than looks back and go, well, it was 50 years ago, But yeah, there was a story that someone who read the book sent me a Facebook message and said, well, I always wondered what happened, so and so, and I looked it up, and it's a suspicious death.
Oh, right.
But as you said, I need to get, as you know yourself, you need to find, if you're going to go to, you need to get police records and FBI records if they exist, and you need to be able to find people to talk to. Because if it happens,
and if that brings up another point, you in this you had to do the research. You live in Los Angeles, and this crime took place in Fairbanks, so I'm sure you racked up the frequent flyer miles just researching it. But it occurred to me that maybe you were lucky that the FBI was involved in it, because you could apply through the Freedom of Information Act for the files, and it's difficult to get files in Alaska from the troopers or the police for a murder that was never solved, for cases still open, and even an old case. I don't know this old if that's true, but
no, you're absolutely right. Because a lot of, as I found out during research, and obviously there are some police forces that will routinely destroy old files as a matter of routine. There are some that will keep some randomly. There were some that will keep, in Alaska, I had the problem of territorial and state records.
Yeah.
Because the case straddled the two.
Yeah.
So the territorial ones were hard to get hold of, but once it became a state, that was a lot easier. They were very organized then. But yeah, I found stuff from all over the place occasionally, because plus it was, 60, 70 years ago. Why would anyone have kept it other than, almost by accident?
Right.
Because it's not like they're going to bring a case now.
No, they're not going to.
But they've got plenty to get on with. They don't really have the time, I assume, to go, let's go through the old archives and get rid of some old case,
Yeah,
they just leave them there.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
The FBI will keep them forever because it's public and you can request them. But I've requested a lot of stuff from the FBI over the years, and you don't always get a hit. Very rarely. It seems like it has to have been a fairly big case in some ways for them to have kept it.
I've never even tried that. That's really a very good
you
idea.
should. It's easy. People ask me that a lot. It's an online process. You can absolutely do it. It's really, you just put your name and address, date of birth. You have to have some idea of the crime and when it happened, and the person's name, obviously, and the date when it happened, and ideally their birth date as well.
Okay.
And you just put a little bit of information and you send it to them. They're fairly quick to get back to you. Often it's a fairly standard letter saying, we can neither confirm nor deny. There's a list of exceptions. There's like medical exceptions because it involves a child, because it involves this, and they can't give them to you. But just every now and then they'll send you some stuff. So I managed to get, I didn't get any stuff from the FBI for the one I'm looking into now, but I managed to get the local police
the inquest
file. which is good.
Yeah, that's good. That's
Um,
good.
but again, I had to work hard for that. You have to be very nice, as you know, Robin. You have to be nice to librarians,
Oh, yes.
archivists, historical
Librarians.
societies. All
Mm-hmm.
those people, be very nice and patient with them because they really want to help and they will help.
Yeah.
But you can't like be pushy or just assume that they've got it all straight to hand, because it's not like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I know that's true. In this book, you shed light on a couple of things I like to really cover in my podcasts and newsletters. And the first is I like to talk about Alaska's history through the crimes I write about. And the second, wherever relevant, I point out Alaska's historical and present deplorable statistics of violence against women. And I'll cover the second one in a minute, but the first one, how did Alaska's history impact the investigation and lack of prosecution in this case? And I think this is really interesting because usually it's kind of the other way around. Usually, I use the crime to magnify what was going on in the state's history at that time. But in this case, the history of the state impacted the investigation of the crime. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was something that came a little bit later that for me to really think about. But I mean, I can't prove any of it because I'm sure no one would ever have written it down or said so. But I think it's possible that the Cecil Wells murder was certainly the family, Cecil Wells's family thought so. They thought his murder was kind of brushed under the carpet a little, maybe sort of ignored a little because Alaska was trying so hard for statehood. And his murder, he was pretty high profile in Alaska.
Yeah.
I mean, the example I give is that the day of the murder, he and Diane were supposed to go down to Anchorage for the opening of the airport in Anchorage, which was a huge deal in Anchorage and in Alaska. I mean, it's the biggest airport, I'm sure, in Alaska.
Yeah.
But of course, Cecil got murdered, and his death was the headline of the Anchorage Daily Times, not the airport opening. So it was considered more important than the airport opening.
Wow.
And he was quite well known and important. And I think it's possible that because of his murder and that they didn't quickly have a solution, or that it didn't come to trial, let's say that. And then instead of it coming to trial, a young woman killed herself, in Hollywood.
Right.
They're all things that don't look very good in the newspapers. And this particular case had made the lower 48 newspapers. And it was being followed. Usually people didn't care what Alaska was doing and what was going on in Alaska, but this one made it through. And none of these things look good. The police weren't getting they didn't find the murder weapon. It didn't seem like they had a strong case. Then the lead, I guess, suspect kills herself before the trial and leaves these very sad suicide notes. Still don't manage to bring the other guy, Johnny Warren, to trial. And all the time, they're still trying to get to be taken seriously to be a state. And one of the things, without getting too deep into the bushes, but prison system had just changed over, and the prison system wasn't run very well in Alaska. It was very poorly funded, very poorly staffed. And you know that Washington, D.C. was looking at these things, and they were looking at Alaska and going, okay, well, this enormous piece of real estate with almost no people in it, do we really want to take this on? It's going to be very expensive. What's their law and order like? What's their government system like? What's their legal system like? How are they running it now?
Yeah.
How much are we going to have to put into the pot to make this part of the club? And suddenly they're like, wait, so this rich businessman has got murdered in his bed and they haven't found the guy? That doesn't look very good. It'd have been different if it had been in Nome or somewhere. Probably no one would have cared. But this is a big city, And so there was that. And also it was the second of what ended up being 4 robbery murders in Fairbanks.
Yeah.
And all of which were unsolved. So if you were looking at that objectively, you look at this and go, what the hell is going on with the police there? They're not solving any of these murders. So rich, successful white men are being killed in their homes, basically. It's the kind of place we want to take.
Doesn't look good.
It doesn't look good. It just didn't look good all the way along the line. And I doubt it had any effect. Maybe it didn't. But if you were looking, or if you were just someone who looked in the newspapers, say, all you'd seen was murder, young woman kills herself, no trial. That would be your impression of what Fairbanks was like. It's where,
Yeah.
Richard got murdered and no one went to prison.
And also, the district attorney at the time was Ted Stevens, who was very ambitious and looking forward to his career. And I'm
Very
sure,
much so, yes.
and when Diane killed herself, he thought, okay, this is not going to be a winnable
That's not
case.
good.
Yeah, let's just get rid of it.
I mean, he was pretty much, once she killed herself, I never think he was going to go to trial anyway. I think it was too close a call, but it obviously didn't look good that she killed herself, because she was the best suspect by far. Yeah. Also, he was pro-statehood. He had ambitions. This was early in his career.
Right.
He's certainly not going to spend the rest of his career, as young as it was, mentioning that case that he didn't solve that got to be quite famous. Why would he ever mention it again? I mean, I called up the Ted Stevens archives, and to see if there was any specific mention of it, and there really wasn't anything specific.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I looked at his early history, and they don't even really talk about it.
Why would he mention it? Because it was pretty high profile, and it didn't get solved.
Right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Cecil's deplorable treatment of Diane, as well as at least one of his other wives. I don't think I'm stepping out on a limb too far to guess all of his wives. He had 5, and we know that he beat at least one of his wives, knocked her down while they were walking down the street. And one of Diane's friends saw Diane with a bruise on her face and asked her what happened. And she said, oh, it was just Cecil or something like that. And so we can guess that he beat her a little bit. And so, before I read your last chapter is very good. You write about what you think happened on the night of October 17th, 1953. And you do a great job. You bring in so many facets of the case into that one single thing. You obviously really thought it out. But before I read that, I stopped and said, what do I think happened to Diane? And there's so many things swirling around, like you talked about the break-ins and some of the characters that Diane knew, and things that were going on. And I kind of moved that out of the way. And the answer to me was so obvious. Diane was an abused woman, and Cecil really beat her up. I mean, you have the photos in the book that show her face that last day. And I think she just got tired of him and grabbed a gun and ended it, because she really couldn't go to the police. I mean, 1950, Alaska, they're not going to get involved in a marriage. And she couldn't claim self-defense. That might work today, but back then, I think she would have likely gone to jail for many years if she'd admitted to the crime. So, I agree with you completely on what happened there.
Yeah, it was that made the case seem very modern to me, because again, today, women in domestic abuse situations, and men as well, often police don't want to get involved. Right. Often it's considered something very shameful and embarrassing to be sorted out within the family. And if you go back to the 1950s, it was a very different social structure. I mean, this was when you were allowed to discipline your kids, and that was considered very good parenting. It wasn't considered completely out of order if a man did hit his wife. That was considered to be like, that's what a husband could do.
Right.
And so I did get definite people telling me in interviews that they had seen it and they had evidence of him doing it. But what was she going to do? She goes to the police. What's she going to do? She's worried about Mark, their son. So she's going to take Mark. Remember, Cecil's very rich and influential throughout the whole of Alaska. She probably doesn't have her own bank account. There's no ATM cards.
Right.
She's probably not working. She's probably a homemaker, as they would call it. So what's she going to do? Just run away? Yeah. I mean, she's going to completely start again. So as many couples will do that are in crisis or having problems, they just hope that it gets better and stick at it. Yeah. And so I think that had been what had happening, as you said earlier, that when the police took witness statements that the day after the murder, several of the neighbors said they'd heard shouting and arguing and screaming and crying. You know, even from the boy, which could have been Mark just crying because he was a kid, but it sounded like he was perhaps getting a hard time. But again, in those days, that was good parenting.
Yeah.
You know, and so you get yourself in that situation, and without spoiling it, it's a bit of a spoiler, but in the last chapter, when I say what I think happens, the pictures the next day of her, she's like panda black eyes, you know, with a swollen face and cut lips and stuff. And people were saying to me, well, you know, that she paid for a hitman and the hitman beat her up as well. And I was like, listen, if I was paying for a hitman, I would not pay for a hitman to beat me up. I would say, tie me up and put me in the closet, because then it looks like you know, you're not going to get someone to beat. And they said, well, perhaps a hitman, she got a friend to do it. And I was like, how many instances do you hear where you would ask a friend, please hit me repeatedly in the face? No, it just doesn't seem rational. But, you know, the police found 2 guns in the house when they searched it, neither obviously with a murder weapon. And this is, as you know, within Alaska, you know, lots of people are gun owners. At the time, you didn't have to have a license or anything or register guns. She may have had her own. There may have been another one in the house. But if she'd got beaten like she was, and I suggested like she woke up, or in the midst of it, it might have been the first time or the 50th time, she may have just gone, she may have just wanted to scare him. She may have just wanted to scare the living daylights out of him and said, look, you do that again, I won't miss next time. Or she might have just gone in and wanted to scare the living daylights out of him. And I think she hit him. She shot him from the door, or near to the door, by accident, and then thought to herself, okay, now what the hell do I do?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe she didn't want to injure him. You know, maybe she wanted to just hit his leg so he couldn't go on this very important trip to Anchorage, you know, to the airport. Maybe she was just aiming for his feet, you know, just to give him an injury so that he doesn't do that again, you know? These are all things that seem rational to me. But then she shoots and she hits him in the head. People said to me, well, he was hitting the side of the head. She must have been right next to him when he did it. Well, the thing is, if you shoot someone in the head right next to them, it goes everywhere. I mean, it doesn't, you know, it's like an explosive effect.
Exactly.
You know, and that's why I think what she did was she didn't call police straight away. She called a couple of friends, probably just to say, what the hell have I done? And they would have come down and probably said, well, you know, I saw this coming, you know, maybe I saw this coming. You still shouldn't have done it, but I saw this coming. And then they maybe tried to decide what to do and to stick to a story or come up with a story. And there had been robberies recently. Rich people 2 men had broken into rich people's houses and stolen money and shot people. So that was an utterly plausible story. And it was still a plausible story. She stuck to that till the end. She said it was 2 men who broke into the apartment.
That's and you know, she'd just been beaten up. She probably couldn't think very clearly, you know. I wouldn't be able to think clearly if I'd had that much head trauma.
No, I mean, she was, you know, she'd clearly been beaten, and I'm sure she was terrified and hysterical and was thinking, right, well, I'm going to jail. I'm going to lose my son. She already had 2 daughters from her first marriage that she was estranged from, that she wasn't in touch with. So she's like, so now I've lost another child, never going to get to see him again. You know, and the thing is, this isn't my fault per se. You know, he's been treating me badly for years, but no one's going to care. They're just going to look at me and go, oh, look, which is what they did. Oh, look, the young, blonde, attractive wife, she's obviously after his money. She probably realized they were going to find out about Johnny Warren. And she was like, well, that's it. I'm going to be condemned. There's no chance for me.
And that's I'm sure it's a helpless feeling. Women get trapped into that even today. And
still happens today. That's the thing.
And the 1950s in Alaska, it was not a good time for women in Alaska.
No.
Well, I have tons of more questions, but we are running out of time. So I want to thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so sorry I went on too long. Do you have a couple of quick ones? I'll give 1-sentence answers. Was there one you really wanted to ask?
Well, no, I was going to go into a little bit into Johnny Warren, and and that was salacious. That made the tabloids.
Yeah.
But I mean, married white rich woman and an African American married musician had an affair. But I don't really think that factored in too much to the investigation. And
absolutely.
and you
If
brought
Johnny
that
had
up.
been if Johnny had been a white guy, I think they'd have left it alone. But they kept the investigation going for years after Diane's suicide. And 56, 57, they were saying, "Oh, we're about to go to trial. We're about to bring Johnny to trial," and then they'd immediately cancel it again.
Oh man.
And part of that was, again, I'm sure, because they were going for statehood and were going, "Have you still not solved that case yet? That's still not come to trial. What's happening? Oh, we're bringing him to trial. We're bringing him to trial." Maybe it was that, but yeah, he was definitely. They were definitely going to go for him if they couldn't get her. But in the end, they couldn't, because I don't think he had anything to do with it. I doubt he was even within 500 yards of anything on that night.
And all they had was very, very loose circumstantial evidence, and it just didn't hold true.
No, I mean, he was at the Northwood Building the night of the murder, but as you've said, the Northwood Building was kind of like a center of what was going on downtown. There were bars there and cafes and stuff. Lots of people would have been at the Northwood Building. It wasn't an apartment building. There were all these other businesses on the bottom floor.
Right.
So it wasn't weird that he was there. He wasn't hanging around on the steps and everyone was thinking, "What's that guy doing there?" There were tons of people there. So that was about the closest they had. And I know that he'd been having an affair with her. But that was enough for a conspiracy. And that was what they looked at.
Yeah. Well, thank you, James, so much for talking about this. It's a very interesting book. I really, really highly recommend it.